Good morning. It's good to see all of you. I'm Reverend Michelle Scott-Huffman. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the minister here at First UU. Today I celebrate the blessing of being in this space, looking at all your beautiful faces, whether they are on a box on the Zoom screen or here in person in the sanctuary. Anytime we talk about blessings, it seems necessary to talk about the fact, as AJ mentioned, that sometimes, many times in fact, we're just not feeling it. And also that the language of blessing and curse has been used in some religious circles as a form of judgment and, quite frankly, just bad theology. So I want to be careful and clear not to suggest some kind of naive optimism that shows no respect for the very real sorrows and struggles that we experience in our lives. And not to muddle sheer luck and privilege with divine blessing. Rather, I hope to explore a path that upon which others accompany us on a journey from tragedy, heartbreak, and exceedingly difficult circumstances to a place of recovery and renewal. It is a path, I think, that has to travel through community. The image that you see on the screen, thank you to Luna, who's willing to jump through hoops to do the things that I didn't ask to do in advance, is a photo that I took on June 15th, 2016. At the end of a vigil that I led in honor of the victims of the Pulse nightclub tragedy. Our little church in Jefferson City, the only open and affirming church there, hosted the only vigil that was held locally because, with the exception of the even smaller than us UU Fellowship, every other congregation that considered it was paralyzed by their inability to reconcile renouncing violence specifically against LGBTQ persons of color and praying for their families with the doctrine and theologies that had either explicitly or implicitly long since labeled those victims as subhuman or apostate. So on that night, our little sanctuary became the community sanctuary for our folks, but also for Catholics and Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, Pentecostals, and more, who couldn't say the things that they wanted to say in their own religious spaces, and who needed a place to grieve and to process with others. So I cleaned out the local craft store of their colored pillar candles, creating a rainbow of light made of 50 candles, one for each of the Pulse victims and one for the perpetrator of the violence, for whom something had gone terribly wrong in life. As we went through the evening with different religious leaders and lay people offering prayers, sharing poems, reading aloud the name of each victim, those pillar candles burned and burned. And as they burned, the wax of one candle flowed down onto the tablecloth, running up against the wax of the candle next to it, a different color of the rainbow, but a similar pattern and flow. What resulted was a hauntingly beautiful image of the ways that those 50 lives ran together that night. A confluence that meant the end of this story for 49 victims, and that meant their families and friends were forever changed. To be honest, the product that came out of that vigil, that ritual, was so deeply touching to me that I carried that purple tablecloth with the dried wax, the dried rivers of melted rainbow wax stuck to it, from one office to another, and finally to my home, where it still lives carefully wrapped and boxed to preserve as much as possible the sense of shared community lament that we experienced that night. The rainbow cloth that is draped around the center candle and is also here in the sanctuary with me was draped around that candle and got wax on it in different places, and it still has some wax stains on it. Yesterday, it was wrapped around my daughter Morgan's neck like a scarf. at a pride event here in Springfield. She asked me what was on it that felt a little stiff, and I remembered that room, those tears, and the names of some of the ones who left us 6 years ago today. I wonder if this stained, stiff rainbow cloth that was freshly dyed by my dear friend Grace and laying on the communion table at my ordination, later sitting in a pool of wax at the vigil for victims of a mass shooting, used at numerous ecclesia events as a sign of welcome and inclusion, and wrapped yesterday around my daughter's neck as a joyful symbol of pride, is a tangible sign of blessing for us. Of the blessings that arise from pain and heartbreak, and the blessings that form in us over many years through steadfast hope and resilience. Let me be clear that I cannot and will not gloss over the pain and anguish of the families impacted by such an act of violence. They too will experience healing and blessing. But we must be careful not to push someone experiencing injustice and tragedy to count their blessings. To do so would be to dishonor their own grieving process. These then are the blessings that we offer to one another when we stand for and with one another in the tragic gap. We honor and hold space for anger and sadness and even some bitterness. In some ways, running interference for those who need that protected space, while also lifting up our undying hope that we can and will act to create better, kinder, and safer communities and a better world. In the case of Pulse, the bar owner and impacted families would eventually demonstrate that hope themselves by forming the One Pulse Foundation, which they say was established to create a sanctuary of hope following the tragic day in American history, Sunday, June 12, 2016, to honor the 49 angels that were taken, the 68 others who were injured, and the countless first responders and healthcare professionals who treated them. The fund is intended to support a memorial that opens hearts, a museum that opens minds, and educational programs that open eyes, and legacy scholarships that open doors. Those who were impacted are now standing in the tragic gap for others who experience discrimination and violence against their communities. Parker Palmer writes about the tragic gap in his book, Healing the Heart of Democracy. He talks about the importance of learning how to stand and act in the tragic gap if we want to hang in for the long haul with birthing a better world. Palmer says, on one side of that gap are the harsh and discouraging realities around us. On the other side is the better world we know to be possible, not merely because we wish it were so, but because we have seen it with our own eyes. We're surrounded by greed, but we've seen great acts of generosity. We're surrounded by violence, but we've seen people make peace. The tragic gap will never close once and for all, a fact that can lead us into despair and resignation. But if we recall the ample evidence that the better angels of our nature are still with us, we are more likely to keep working at and making the world a better place. Our actions to create a better world in the face of tragedy, to keep working for peace and justice against what sometimes feels like insurmountable odds. The fact that love continues to bud and grow for people in every kind of place and circumstance, these are blessings. When I think of the stories that Chase Wilhelm has shared about his work to move Ukrainian refugees to safety, and picture children with few belongings and maybe a cherished blanket, piled into cars traveling through the night to places unknown, I think about the stories those blankets will hold, and wonder if generations down the line, grandchildren will carefully preserve the blanket that left home under cover of darkness with their grandparent, tattered and torn and having borne witness to both tragedy and victory. Sometimes the things that remain become the vessel for future blessings. Likewise, the people who remain tell the stories and are themselves blessings and have the ability, and I might say responsibility, to speak and act blessing into the lives of others. This is the aluminum foil, the silver lining that the community holds space for, that the community holds time for those who can't see past the current crisis or tragedy, but together somehow we offer the simple hope of continuity. In my last year of seminary, I did something called the Clinical Pastoral Education, or CPE. In CPE, someone preparing for ministry works in a clinical setting, offering pastoral care, and then processes those experiences with a cohort of others doing the same work. One of the goals of CPE is to use the experience of providing pastoral care to dig deeper into oneself, to find the stuff, the baggage, so to speak, that might come up for us as caregivers at the worst possible moment and keep us from offering our best care to the person in need. It is a deeply challenging and vulnerable experience, and also incredibly valuable. For instance, I was faced regularly during those 15 weeks with my own desire to fix things and just have everything be okay, when my area of care was the ICU, where I regularly sat with families whose loved ones wouldn't be going back home. I can remember the dissonance that I would feel when I had sat for hours with a family, and upon their loved ones passing, I would walk out of the hospital into a world that had just continued to spin. Everybody was just out there doing the same things that they were doing before. The first couple of times I remember thinking, what's wrong with these people? Don't they know that for someone the world just stopped spinning? By about the third time, though, I came to understand that this was the blessing. That when one of us is facing a difficult end, someone else is experiencing a beautiful beginning, and that when some of us need to just be suspended in time and space to grieve, to process, to recover, and then finally to re-engage the world, others are keeping it moving for us, holding our place in the line to wherever it is that we will go. In the blessing that we read earlier from Jan Richardson, we heard, in every place where a world is ending, may we turn toward one another with wild and stubborn hope. If you are interested in the practice of speaking, reading, or writing blessings that might sustain us through hard times, I would recommend some of Jan Richardson's blessings, particularly those in her book, The Cure for Sorrow, a book of blessings for times of grief. I would also recommend John O'Donohue, who writes blessings filled with Celtic wisdom. In the introduction to the book, To Bless the Space Between Us, O'Donohue says, it would be infinitely lonely to live in a world without blessing. The word blessing evokes a sense of warmth and protection. It suggests that no life is alone or unreachable. Each life is clothed in raiment of spirit that secretly links it to everything else. Though suffering and chaos befall us, they can never quench that inner light. He says his blessings are an attempt to reach into that tenuous territory of change that we must traverse when a threshold invites us. Each blessing is intended to present a minimal psychic portrait of the geography of change it names. Elsewhere, he writes, it would be lovely if we could rediscover our power to bless one another. I believe each of us can bless. When a blessing is invoked, it changes the atmosphere. And so this morning, as we all sit with the circumstances of our own lives, joy and sorrow, challenge and suffering, celebration, all the things that we bring with us, I invite you to gently remember the difficult times, and with gratitude to acknowledge the eventual gifts of those moments if you can. And for those of us for whom the struggle and difficulty is too fresh, know that this community holds you. We stand in the gap for you. We bless you with our words, with our love, and with our actions. I'll close with this short blessing from John O'Donohue entitled, "To Come Home to Yourself." May all that is unforgiven in you be released. May your fears yield their deepest tranquilities. May all that is unlived in you blossom into a future graced with love. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.